to enter the shoes of Shri Dvijendra Tripathi, who is known as the father of business history. The entire nation is proud and confident that Dr. Chinmay Thumbe will take this subject of business history to the higher level, presenting before you young, dynamic, fact-driven, knowledgeable resource, Dr. Chinmay Thumbe. Welcome.
Thank you so much for this very kind invitation. I'll speak, I think on the side you have to enable me as a host because I still can't share my slides. So I think you just have to make me a host on that. But this is a great event to be a part of. So thanks a lot for this very kind invitation. I'm a student of a Commerce and Arts College in Mumbai. Unfortunately, not MCC, but I was in the Matunga area for many years from 2002 to 2000, actually 2000 to 2005, 5 years of my life in which I spent at Podar and Ruya College respectively. And since then I've been working on a variety of topics, and both these themes for today, migration and pandemics, are very close to my heart. I would really enjoy speaking on this. It's also interesting that because this is a lecture in the honor of none other than Lokmanya Tilak, that it's also very interesting because both my books, if you ask me what some of the common people or personalities which feature in both my books, which is on migration and pandemics, interestingly, Lokmanya Tilak is one of them. And if you say, why should Tilak feature in a book on migration? Why should Tilak feature on a book on pandemics? But he's there, and he's the kind of personality who will make an entry in almost most themes of Indian history. And the reason is very simple. In the book on migration, he's one of the most famous rural to urban, or let's call it urban to urban migrants from one of the districts which I'm going to talk about today, which is really a district with a kind of world record in migration history called Ratnagiri. And I'm sure many of us, I trace some roots of mine to Ratnagiri. Many of y'all do. Ratnagiri, which we know is devastated by the recent crisis. But it's a kind of a district which has sent out so many people across India, across the world. And you'll also be surprised to know that Ratnagiri is a district. If you look at the Bharat Ratna awardees, no district of India has given more Bharat Ratna awardees than Ratnagiri. Right? So it's one of those remarkable statistics that come up. And of course, Tilak is one of those great personalities who comes out of Ratnagiri. Of course, spends most of his time in Mumbai and so on, in Pune. And in the world of pandemics, Tilak is, of course, again, a very important figure in the plague pandemic, which really rocks India from about 1896 to roughly 1920 and so on. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But just to kind of motivate that discussion, Tilak was a very staunch critic of the way the British were managing the pandemic. In that whole context, I think all of you are aware of the assassination which happened in Pune of the Safekar brothers assassinated Walter Rand. And Tilak was also sent to jail for that year. The Ganpati festival was banned. So he got into all sorts of trouble. But his basic concern was very simple. How do you protect people in a pandemic without going overboard and having mass surveillance? It's a very important theme as we start talking about pandemics today. So with that, brief touch on the great Lokmanya Tilak in the context of both migration and pandemics, I'm going to share a few slides. This is going to be a presentation of about half an hour. And after that, I'll be happy to take questions and so on. So I'm assuming that you can see the screen. Right, so these are my two books, India Moving and The Age of Pandemics. One is on movement of people. The other is the movement of diseases. And of course, in a sense, they're very linked. If you think very carefully, you cannot really have a pandemic without some migration. Right? And to curtail a pandemic, you do have to curtail migration to a certain extent. Now, how much is, of course, a big public policy question, but that is a fundamental point. And that is why, precisely because these two topics are so closely linked, we have seen it at very close quarters, especially in the last 1 or 2 years. So today I'm going to talk about pandemics and migration, both burning public policy questions as to what should we be doing, how do we make the lives of people, especially migrants, better and better. And I'll start with this image. A very defining image which came from last year. The person who took this photograph, Danish Siddiqui, is unfortunately no more. He was killed just a few weeks back by the Taliban in Afghanistan in a very shocking incident. But Danish Siddiqui took some amazing photographs of this pandemic, and this is one of those very brutal photographs which shows you the pain of the migrant workers who literally had to walk back home last year during the pandemic. It was a really cruel sight, and it's also interesting that we did not see really such sites this year. There's also been a lot of learning from 2020 to 2021 and so on. But the reason I'm starting out here is to show you another picture actually, and I hope you can see this picture on your screens. This is a picture from a very different time, from 1897, and what you're seeing are migrant workers running away from Bombay, then called Bombay, and this is a scene from Victoria Terminus Station. Now it is called CST. This is VT on 6th February 1897, and as the artist called it, the pandemic plague in India, the exodus from Bombay. Right? And I want you to kind of look at these two pictures to kind of understand the gravity of the situation. You can see in both cases the anxiety, on the faces. That is, there's a lot of insecurity written on the faces. You can see on one picture the man is holding the child. In the other picture, a woman is holding the child. In both places, people are trying to run away from the city. Right? And this is an important kind of recurring theme that happens in pandemics. That is, pandemics, one of the first classic things that happen in all pandemics, which we know about, especially in India, this is not the first pandemic, there have been many pandemics in the past in India, is that migrant workers want to get back to their villages. Right? And so this is a very important kind of a stylized fact of pandemics. Now, I'll come to this in a bit later as to how the British thought about migration and pandemics vis-a-vis how we are now thinking about pandemics and migration. So I'm going to just start the discussion with these two pictures taken literally 120 years apart, but in both contexts, a very similar feeling, a feeling of hopelessness and a crisis to get back. Of course, the difference was that in 2020, the trains were not working, and unfortunately, many people had to walk back home. So I'll start firstly talking about migration. I'm going to abstract out of pandemics and talk a little bit. I'm going to talk about 10 minutes on migration. But what do we really know about migration in India? And then I'm going to talk about what do we know about pandemics in India, and then try and make the connection between the two. So here's a picture of different modes of traveling in India in the past. This is an image which was published in the middle of the 19th century. And of course, there's an elephant, there's people on all sorts of, there's a traveling beggar, as it's called, dock, a billy, caravan, palki dock, different names given. And the British, this is done by the British. The last panel that you see was the railways. It says the East Indian Railway. And the whole depiction of this is that while people have been on the move since eternity, obviously migration did not start in the 19th century. People have been on the move forever. What definitely changed from the late 19th century was the speed of movement. For the first time, human beings could really move very fast. So until then, about 2000 odd years, we were constrained by the speed of the horse. And suddenly the horsepower really improved tremendously through the steam engine, which backed the boats, the steamboats, and the railways. As a result, from the middle of the 19th century, Indians in particular started moving in large numbers, not only within the country, but outside. Think of Mauritius, think of the Caribbean or West Indies, what we call as indentured migration and so on. So we say this is the first wave of truly mass migration, where something like 50 million Europeans went to the American world, something like 30 million Indians left the Indian subcontinent to go to all these other places of the world, including Burma, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and so on. And some of the places which started in that period are well known to us. And that's why now I'm going to talk about two districts of India, very famous districts, especially since all of you are based in Mumbai. I'm sure many of you who are watching this right now trace your roots to Ratnagiri district. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I'm sure many of you do. And Ratnagiri district, of course, has a very close connection to Mumbai forever. And the other one, of course, is Udupi. And Udupi is a district in Karnataka today. Is huge connection. And all of us know Udupi today because of the famous Udupi restaurants. Right? And obviously, a lot of these migrants actually did work in those restaurants. I remember I was in Matunga, and also some of the best restaurants there were all run by the people from Udupi. Now, this chart, what does it show? It shows the y-axis is a chart. It shows sex ratio. Okay, so it just basically says how many females were there per 1,000 males. Okay, and the x-axis is all the years, census years from 1901 to 2011. So basically what I'm showing you is a time series of sex ratio of Ratnagiri and Udupi for 110 years. And what does this show? If you see the India line, it's at roughly 950 throughout, okay, plus or minus a little bit. But just look what's happening to Ratnagiri and Udupi. We are saying that for the last 120 years, these two districts of India are districts with missing men. It's a word which I use in my research. Unlike what Amartya Sen said about missing women, which is about gender discrimination and so on, the missing men phenomenon in India is huge. What we are saying here is that these districts are districts with more women than men. In India, usually it's the reverse. What we're saying is that in these districts, there are more women than men. In Ratnagiri, for example, we're saying 1,200 females to 1,000 men. And so where are the men? They are in Mumbai, right? They are not, not just Mumbai, they're in Surat, they're in the Gulf today, they're in various other parts, but they're not in the districts. Okay, and you can see the sex ratio by age, and you'll see that these sex ratios are very normal in the age group above 50. So there's a particular period of life from say 20 to 40 where these migrants, male migrants, usually move out and then they come back. Now remember, when we talk about migration in India, most migrants in India are actually women, right? Because every adult woman in India is a migrant, because after marriage you move from one place to another. But if you look at work-related migration, it is more or less of men. Okay, so that is the basic distinction you're making. And Ratnagiri and Udupi are two districts, but they are not the only two districts which look like this. This is the map of India, and Ratnagiri and Udupi are just two of hundreds of districts of India which send out men in particular in large numbers to work in the cities. Now, this is a tremendous migration phenomenon of India. This is the map of India, and I want you to see the red shaded districts. I'll start with Ratnagiri, which is a district here. I hope you can see my mouse moving. Ratnagiri is a district here, all of you know, on the Konkan region. And Udupi is a district here, and they're shaded in red. What does the red color mean? It means that more than 25% of households in those districts are sending a person outside. Right? We call these districts mass migration districts. And this is data from 2007-8. But if you did a survey today, you would get very similar details. And if you compare it with my earlier chart, what we are saying is that migration in India is not something which started yesterday or even a generation back. From the late 19th century, there are over 100 districts of India which have been sending out migrants in large numbers for generations altogether. Right? So what are the characteristics of this migration? And I've written it down on the left. I call this the Great Indian Migration Wave. This is the world's largest and longest voluntary migration system. No, this is not slavery. Right? People are going on their own will. You can say there are no economic opportunities, but that's different from slavery. This is still a voluntary migration. This is not trafficking that we're talking about. So where are these red shaded districts of India? So you'll see that the entire west coast of India, from pretty much Kanyakumari in the south to Ratnagiri, is shaded red. Right? So that we're saying one side of the Western Ghats is completely out migration districts. People are leaving those districts to work elsewhere. Then you go to coastal Orissa on one side, mass migration. 100 years back, they used to go to Burma. Now they go to Gujarat. And then you have this massive cluster, which I'm sure all of you in Bombay are very well aware of, which is Eastern UP and Bihar. It's not all of Uttar Pradesh. Remember, the average Uttar Pradesh migrant that you meet in Mumbai is coming from a few districts in Eastern UP, districts like Jaunpur, Azamgarh, and so on. Okay, and a lot of Biharis, of course, who are working in there. Then you have districts in Gujarat. We think many people go to Gujarat to work, which is true, but there are districts in Gujarat which send people out. A lot of Kutchis, for example, move to Mumbai. A lot of people from Bhavnagar and Amreli work in the diamond factories of Surat. If you look at Rajasthan, a huge number of districts are sending out people to Ahmedabad, Surat, and Delhi. And then you look at the Himalayan states like Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, they are also sending out people. So where are these people going? They are going mainly to cities. The major cities of India absorb these migrants. But what is the pattern of migration? It is male dominated. It is semi-permanent, which means, believe it or not, most migrants who come to our cities do not settle down in our cities, they go back. right? Which means if you see the average, say, cab driver in Mumbai, who might be from Jaunpur district in Uttar Pradesh, very few of them actually will retire in Mumbai, like many of you. I'm sure many of you watching this are migrants to Mumbai, but it's quite likely that you have chosen Mumbai and you're like quite likely either you were born in Mumbai or you're going to settle down in Mumbai for life. Now, that is not the case in the huge class of migrants that we are talking of right now. These are migrants who work in India's urban informal economy. They are our carpenters, they're the plumbers, they're the drivers, they're the construction workers, they're the cooks. This is what we call as the urban informal economy. And this is the picture that we saw last year when people were walking back home. These are the migrants we're talking about, right? It is not this audience, it is not me who was affected last year in great economic distress. We didn't really, when the government said please stay in your place, we stood in our place because we had the capacity to do so. But for the average person, the average migrant worker in the urban informal economy of India, life is quite precarious, and if there's an extended lockdown, it can hit you quite badly. And so that is why there was a massive migration crisis last year, because the numbers are staggering. And for the first time, actually, last year, what we say is that these migrant workers until last year were actually invisible. You know, the numbers are 100 million. There are over 100 million migrant workers in India. And this is not, these are what we call as circular migrant workers. These are not the, you and me, you know, I'm in Ahmedabad right now. I moved from Mumbai. Even I am a migrant worker, but I'm not a temporary or a circular migrant worker. I don't go to Mumbai back and forth too often. These are people who are spending about 10 months in a year outside their village, then go back for their vacation, and then eventually retire back in the village. So when we say there's a lot of rural to urban migration in India, there is also a lot of urban to rural migration when the people become old. Right? And so net rural to urban migration in India is actually not that high. There are some circles on this map which basically talk about seasonal migration. These are even more short-term migrations of 3 to 4 months. These are mainly in rural farm harvesting work, construction, manufacturing, and all those regions. You'll see that their geography is very different. So the question to ask is, what explains this? Why is it that some parts of India send out a lot of migrants and others don't? And you might think that this is poverty. Obviously, people are moving because there is no money. But you'll be surprised to know that the richest parts of India, which is the Western Ghats, in this Kanyakumari to Mumbai kind of a stretch, and the poorest parts of India, which is Eastern UP and Bihar, the richest parts and the poorest parts in India have some of the same rates of out-migration. Right? So let me put this as a thought experiment. That is, Bihar will take many decades to reach where Kerala is, for example, today in terms of education, health, variety of parameters. Yet there is no guarantee that migration will stop from Bihar. Often we think, if Bihar becomes rich, then nobody will have to migrate. But that's not the case, because Kerala is one of the richest parts of India. And you should know that a lot of Keralites work in the Gulf countries. So what explains migration? Of course, people are going for better wages in different capacities. But the fundamental driver of migration in India is not poverty, it is population density. What is common between both Kerala and Bihar is that it's extremely high rural population density. That means in Madhya Pradesh, in much of central India, where their population density is not so high, there is enough that agriculture can absorb. But in Kerala and Bihar, agriculture and rural areas simply cannot provide opportunities to the population. Right? So whatever you do, it is almost impossible to contain the population. So they're going to head to a city. Now you can say that maybe if Lucknow and Patna developed as well as Mumbai and Delhi, then the migrants would go there. And that's a very good logic. But that's very different from saying, if we only develop the villages, then nobody would have to leave India, rural India. But that logic is you find the evidence on that very slim. In India, wherever rural areas have prospered, whether it is in Maharashtra, whether it is in Andhra Pradesh, whether it is in Punjab, the first thing farmers have done is actually to leave. The richer you get in India, especially in rural India, the more likely it is that you're going to leave the place. Why? Because your aspirations change. You don't want to do farming anymore. You want to get into the so-called professional class. Right? I think all of you, I'm sure at least some of you have some land back home in Ratnagiri. A lot of people in Mumbai have, a lot of the Konkan people in Mumbai have some land. They might have a mango orchard also if you're rich enough. And you might go for a vacation back home. The attachment to the land is very there, but you are pretty much well settled in Pune and Mumbai. That is because you have made it. You are one of those migrants who have made it, who has the capital to stay in a city. But for most migrants, actually, the city life is rewarding, but rewarding only to a certain extent where you can make your life back home possible. So the psychology of the migrant worker is such that is the bulk of the migrant workers in Mumbai, if you ask me, come not with the mentality to stay in Bombay, but to make most amount of money and eventually go back home. Right? And that is why we say in the slums of Mumbai, while there is a lot of poverty, there's a lot of also rich people who live in Bombay slums, precisely because the objective is to reduce housing costs. The objective is to save as much to send back home what we call as remittances and support livelihoods. This is a chart of urbanization and migration, which it just shows you that in India's Bihar and UP, where urbanization is less, out migration is much more. So what are the types of migration? I've talked about duration. That's very important. People move. The key takeaway from today's talk should be that most work-related migration in India is circular in nature, and that is why we got the crisis. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
Can I ask one question here? I
Please
want
do.
to make it clear. Will you show that previous slide, please, sir?
Yeah.
Yes. One more.
This
Previous.
one. This
No,
one.
earlier. Yes.
This one.
Sir, sorry to disturb you.
No problem.
What you are saying that is based upon your estimates on the basis of the NSS data 2007-8.
Yeah.
But if you take into account the census data related to the migration, do you think that your estimates based upon the NSS data in 2007-8 that would be different if you take into account the 2011 census data?
Yeah. So the first thing to note is that the census does a very poor job in capturing out migration. The census is useful to capture in migration because the census asks you a question if you are a migrant. So if the census officer comes to your office in Mumbai, right, and if they basically ask you two questions: Are you were you born here? What is your place of last residence? What is your place of birth? And based on that, you would be classified as a migrant. So it's based on census data that we can say that say 40 to 50% of Mumbai was born outside Mumbai or their last place of residence, right? And that is also what the national sample survey. But you cannot generate a map like I have done right now with the census, because the census does not ask you a question: is there anyone in your household who has gone away? Are you getting this? There's a question on in-migration, which the census captures. But the national sample survey is the only data set, large nationally representative data set, which also asks a question on out migration. It asks you a question: do you receive money from people who have gone outside? Right. So that's the nice thing about this data set, that you can draw a map like this. You cannot draw a map with census data of this, because the census can only tell you where people are going towards, whereas this is a map to tell you where people are leaving from. I hope this clarifies. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a difference between what the census does and what the NSS does. I should tell you that the census also underestimates migration for work substantially. We wrote this chapter in the Economic Survey of India, released by the Ministry of Finance in 2016-17. And when we kind of argued that, look, there are more than 100, the census tells us that there are 55 million migrant workers, various ways that, you can show that it's actually much more than 100 million. Again, obviously, when you saw the crisis last year, there were literally millions of people wanting to get back home. The last year's crisis really, for the first time, put the spotlight on migration. That's why we are talking about migration today in the first place. All right, so different types of migration, reasons for migration include students. A lot of the students at MCC, for example, are people coming from outside Mumbai. Migration is selective. As I said, marriage migration is almost completely dominated by women. Migration for work in India is completely dominated by men. Caste matters in the sense that historically, the upper ranking castes were the first to permanently leave their villages. Right? So for example, if you take the urbanization rate in India, it is 31%. But if you take the urbanization rate of Brahmins, it is about 45 to 50%. Right? And if you take the urbanization rate of the scheduled castes, for example, it is about 20%. So historically, urbanization in India, permanent migration, we say, is more dominated by the upper ranking caste. Now, why does this happen? It's because in order to settle down in the city for good, you need to have some starting capital. You need to have social networks. You need to know enough people in the city to settle down well in that city. And that is why, for example, in many of these migration networks, historical social capital and, of course, money capital mattered in actually putting root in one city. For example, think of the Marwadi migrations of business, communities. They had the money. You'll see Marwadis virtually everywhere in India, right? Virtually every city, because it's business-based migration, but they had the money to settle down in the city. Now compare this with a migrant worker from Jaunpur who's driving an auto in Mumbai or a cab. That person may or may not become rich, but the likelihood that that person is, going to go back and have a very good life back home is much more. And hence that person shapes his migration strategy in terms of return, right? And so that's the psychology, that you are never really invested in Mumbai. You have one foot back home. And very similar, by the way, for the bulk of the Ratnagiri migrants as well. Now, how does religion matter in migration? It doesn't matter so much as region. If you ask me which identity really matters in migration, more than gender, caste, or religion, it is region. Which means if you grew up in Kerala, if you grew up in Bihar, it did not really matter whether you belong to a certain caste or religion. Because you saw everyone around you migrating, you also thought that you should migrate. So there is a culture of migration in many parts of India, because you grow up seeing your uncles, your grandparents, your parents, everyone has this migration history. So you think it is very normal. But if you're born in Madhya Pradesh, you would think migration is not normal. You'll see that most people are rooted where they are. So migration often works on a chain. That is, the more people that you know outside, the more likely you yourself are going to. At the beginning of this conversation, we had this nice comment on Parla, and there are a lot of people who leave Parla come back. It's very similar. This idea of return to where you are is very, very strong in the Indian psyche. Okay, think about the commonality in the two epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, is also this. It's circular migration. It's, of course, migration due to exile, but there is that element of return, right? And the return element is very strong. And that is why in the crisis last year, it was not just economic insecurity as to why many people wanted to go back. It was also a psychological reason. Right? So a lot of people last year, for example, said that agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge. That is a non-economic factor as to why people want to go back home, because there's an attachment to land, attachment to the idea that you want to die in the place of your birth. Now, this applies mostly to men rather than women. Okay, so why do people migrate? Obviously, wage differentials is the main thing, economic opportunities, but there are various non-economic reasons. Okay, so peer pressure is one. A lot of kids in the age group 15 to 20 just think of migrating because everyone in the Konkan is migrating, so let's also try a hand. Then, of course, there's anonymity of the city. Ambedkar, for example, famously said that, the city is a great way to get away from the worst aspects or the oppressive aspects of the caste system. Right? And so migration is also seen by many as a form of liberation. That is, as the famous anecdote goes, in a Mumbai local train, obviously you cannot harbor notions of untouchability and so on in a jam-packed local train of Mumbai. So there are economic factors, of course, but there are a lot of non-economic factors that also drive migration. And then there are, of course, reasons on the source region side. Many people initially left Ratnagiri because of a famine, or in Udupi for a flood. If you see people who came to Bombay from Udupi in the 1920s, they were all escaping a flood, a massive flood. So there can be these shocks, which also push out people. Okay, for famine, these are classic sort of reasons as to how networks were created in the first place. So with this broad idea or overview of migration, I've given you some element of where people are moving from, why they are moving, what drives migration. I'm now going to move on to pandemics. And I'm going to start by this idea that India has actually been knocked out by pandemics in the past as well. We've just had this brutal second wave in India where a lot of people have died. India was unfortunately the #1 country hit in the cholera pandemic, in the plague pandemic, and in the influenza pandemic, which killed over 70 million people around the world, of which 40 million people were in India. And I say this because when the pandemic hit us last year, we still say stuff like this was unprecedented. this was once in a century pandemic, and all these elements are true. But the fact is, there seemed to be a collective amnesia about this remarkable era, an era in which, of course, Lokmanya Tilak himself lived in. Right? And so when we learn our history, we of course learn political history, but it's remarkable how very little is actually talked about the pandemics, in particular the 1918 pandemic. 20 million Indians, or 6% of our population, perished in a few months of 1918. And yet we know more about the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy of 1919, right? April 1919. All of us know about the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, in which a few hundred people died, but we really don't know enough. I'm pretty sure until the pandemic, none of us had heard about something called as the Spanish flu or the influenza pandemic, where 20 million, 2 crore Indians died in a few months. Right? It's the world's, by some historians, it's the greatest demographic shock ever received by the human species. And India was the number one hit in all those pandemics. Right? So we have this history of pandemics. Of course, the bad side being that a lot of people were affected, but also the good side, that is a lot of responses came in those pandemics. For example, Tilak's response saying that, look, yes, there's a pandemic, but that doesn't mean that the government can just go and barge into people's houses for checking. That doesn't mean you can just separate families forcefully and take them to centers. Tilak was fighting all of that in the late 1890s when plague hit Pune in particular. And of course, Gokhale also was involved in that. So this is the broad overview of what I call as the age of pandemics from 1817 to 1920. And I should point out that Tilak, passed away in 1920. So Tilak actually lived through most of these years of the age of pandemics. He passed away in 1920. And after 1920, the death rates, not just in India, but around the world, started to fall. The life expectancy rate at birth in the early 20th century was really only about a few, 20 odd years. You could expect to live only 20 years if you were born. Today, you can expect to live 70 years. That is the tremendous progress we've made in the last 100 years. We've added 50 years to the average Indian life. And why? Because we've understood how diseases work. With better science, with better medicine, we've understood how to get down death rates. Right? But an important learning from that is, of course, that you need to trust modern science. You need to trust evidence-based policies. And you can't, and you should definitely, report good and correct data. That's a very important thing and a good important learning that we need to take in this pandemic as well. Again, so I come back to this picture which I started, because this talk, I'm not going to focus on pandemics in its entirety, but its focus and connection with migration. And so I showed you this picture in front. Now, why am I showing this picture again? Is that the British had to make the same policy choices that we had to make last year. Right? In the sense, should we shut down the Indian railways or not? And I'm sure all of you have an opinion. Maybe it was a good thing, because the idea behind it last year was that we should not let the virus reach rural areas. And we've seen this year, when it did reach rural areas, how bad the impact was. So there was, of course, a very noble intention behind it. But the fact is that in India, if you shut down the railways in a pandemic, it's quite likely that migrants will walk back home. And so here the learning from the past is very interesting, because the British actually had to deliberate on this precise topic: should we shut down the trains or not? And the decision they took was the following. They said, we need to curtail movement, but we should first send back the migrant workers back home and then announce a lockdown. And their reasoning was very interesting. They said, look, if we shut down the trains now, people will just walk back home. Because the kind of economic need and the psychological need to go back home in a health crisis is immense. So the British took this decision, which we also took, but we were 2 months late. Right? So you remember last year we ran these Shramik trains, and millions of migrant workers went on these Shramik trains back home. But in those 2 months, what we got was a full-blooded migration crisis, people walking back home, by some estimates in millions. And the counterproductive thing that happened was that a lot of camps were created. A lot of kind of migrant camps, by the government's own admission, over 20,000 migrant camps emerged across India to contain that flow. Right? And that's the last thing you want to do in the pandemic, is to put people in high density, high congestion clusters. So in some sense, that was very counterproductive. And this year, of course, we learned from that mistake and we did not shut down the railways. we have kind of done a very different approach. Localized lockdowns was the approach this year, and of course we have been hit badly in the second wave because the strain was extremely transmissible and so on. But that's an important kind of learning from the past. The other the thing is that this migration and pandemics is not just an Indian story. I'm going to talk 2 minutes about China. Okay, the plague hit China brutally in 1911, and what did the Chinese do back then? They shut down the railways for their migrant workers. So when India shut down our railway system last year, it was not the first time. The Chinese had done it 110 years back as well. What happened in China? This was January 1911, peak winter. As expected, migrant workers started walking back home, and a lot of people died in the winter. Right? So we had these two examples from history last year, and if only public policy makers had that guidance from history saying, look, send the workers first and then announce the lockdown, because we have two instances from history where it doesn't make sense. Broadly speaking, in a country with over 100 million circular migrant workers, any aspect of pandemic management has to take into account what will happen with migrants. And remember, even think of vaccination protocols. The migrant workers have really not figured in the whole vaccination drives. Right? But when you think about it, the migrant workers should be high on the priority, because these are the people who are going to keep moving from place to place. So if there's any spread of the disease, they are, of course, going to be important potential spreaders, and hence they need to be vaccinated upfront. Okay, so this is coming back to this image of what we saw last year. I would claim that this was a completely unnecessary crisis we got from a benevolent intention of trying to stop the disease from going to rural areas, but in the context, we got a full-blown migration crisis, and thankfully this year we did not see those scenes. And so why did so many people go back? Because of this psychological need to, as I said, agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge. This exact statement was also heard on VT station 1897 during the plague, by the way. And of course, a lot of landlords evicted their tenants saying you're not paying your rent. In India, migrants can stay max for a few weeks, right? But if your incomes are not there, then the economic security goes. Okay, I'm just going to run over some of the aspects of our earlier pandemics. This is about plague. Plague really hit a few parts of India, not all parts. This is the famous second wave of the influenza pandemic. The first wave was very mild, just like us, just like in the coronavirus. And the second wave was brutal, just like in India. April and May this year were truly horrific months in Indian history. I should tell you that the mortality extent of April, the mortality shock that we got in April and May this year, it was the last time we have seen such a mortality spike was actually in November 1980. And so it's coming after 103 years. By some estimates now, over 2 million people have died. 400,000 is the official number, but about 2 million people have died. And that's also what we learned from past pandemics, is to report good data. Right? And Maharashtra and Kerala and Karnataka, if you ask me, are three states which are doing a good job. These are all ruled by different political parties, as you can see, Karnataka, Kerala, and Maharashtra, but they are all doing a decent job in going out and reporting the truth. Even then, there is underreporting. But if you see the underreporting factors, they are much smaller in the case of Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Kerala than many other states where underreporting factors are 30 or 40 and so on. So I'll kind of wrap up this talk by pointing about how do we think of pandemics. Now, epidemiologists define pandemics in terms of community level transmission and so on. When I was doing this research on past pandemics, I kind of characterize this in terms of the social stages of pandemic into four. The first is denial. This is where we were last year, the initial stages, where we kept saying that nothing can happen to us. For pretty much all of last year, we kind of went into a sense of false security, saying that Indians have fantastic immunity. The Europeans and Americans, by one famous roadside conversation, because they don't eat pani puri, they don't develop good immunity, and hence they are more prone to disease. Now, these are all scientifically unproven ideas. They make for good conversations, but they're not really scientifically proven. And so you kind of live in a kind of denial phase. And when it actually hits you, like it hit us very badly this year, there's a lot of confusion. Right? And then there's a slow acceptance that, yeah, we are into this. No pandemic in history has gotten over in a few months. It has taken at least 2 years for the pandemic to kind of go out. But what's interesting is that pandemics, unlike other events, we're talking today about migration and pandemics. We could have talked about migration and war, or migration and earthquakes, or migration and flood. Why are pandemics different? Pandemics are different from wars, earthquakes, floods, other calamities, because they are easily forgotten. we kind of remember wars, we memorialize them. We have these, war memorials, India Gate, variety of things. We remember the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy because there's a clearly identifiable enemy. We remember earthquakes and floods because a lot of buildings, there's a lot of visual memory attached. But with the pandemic, people are dying, but otherwise nothing else is crashing. There are no bombs destroying cities and so on. And that is the danger. That is, we tend to forget pandemics so quickly that we are again, the next time it comes around, we are again in denial. And then again, all the similar crises, the migrant flight, it's a continuous cycle which keeps kind of happening. So to wrap up, every pandemic requires some migration. Without migration, you can't have a pandemic because how will the disease go around the world, right? So curtailing a pandemic does require curtailing migration, but how do you do it? And it is easier for international migration. It's easy to switch off our airports and say nobody can come to India. That's easy because nobody is really going to swim all the way from US or the Gulf to India. But if you shut down Bangalore, people can always walk back to Bihar. If you shut down Delhi, people can always walk back to Azamgarh in UP. So there's a difference between international migration and internal migration. And what I would say is that you simply cannot shut down internal migration in a country like India. Last year, we had state border checks. Migrants would just walk along the border down south or north, cross the border, and then continue their journey back. So it's from a very pragmatic view that we should not be shutting down internal mobility. How do we curtail it? We need better quarantine systems when the migrants go back home. If you're going for a lockdown, give migrants both the options. If you're going to stay in the city, provide a lot of social security, free food, free shelter, a variety of social security packages. And if the migrant wants to go back, then arrange the trains so that the migrant goes back at the onset of the pandemic rather than later. Because 100 million circular migrants in India is a huge person. So what are the broad policy options we have? There are four things. One is that India has historically not had portability of social security. If you had a ration for your village, ration card, you could not really access food, subsidized food or other material. If the woman came to the city, she would be locked out of the Anganwadi system. So there is a lot of challenges in India where you can access welfare services only in the source region. Now, thankfully, we now have a one nation, one ration card scheme. That is a good policy which is rolled out, but it's still only on paper. It has to be more on the ground. That's a step in the right direction that we are moving. We need much more affordable rental housing in India. Our overall focus on housing has been ownership-based housing. But what we need, the need of the migrants is not ownership-based housing, but rental housing. And we saw last year that a lot of people were cheated by their landlords, and that's why they had to go back home. We need a good rental housing market, which we don't have. We need to strengthen Manrega so that a lot of people can also get absorbed in the rural workforce if they have to go back. Last year, remember, a lot of people got jobs in Manrega. And finally, an important link between the migrant and the employer in the city is the contractor. Think of the construction industry, for instance. And last year, what happened was that the first person who fled was the contractor. So think about a Bengali migrant worker in Bangalore who does not speak the language, completely clueless, completely scared, completely at the mercy of the city because the contractor had fled. And so that is why we need more, because employers are outsourcing everything to a contractor and the employers themselves don't know who they're dealing with. And this pertains to all of us. We are educational institutions. You all are based on an educational institution. I am. We employ today a lot of contractual labor, contractual workers. We also have a contractor. We need to push for more accountability from these people, saying, where are you getting these people from? What benefits are you getting? If there's a lockdown, what is going to happen to them? So that sort of an empathy has to be there more in. So I'll end here with this idea that pandemics and migration are not new. These are burning public policy questions that have haunted India in the past as well as in the present. And it's good. I'm very glad that MCC has decided to, devote attention to this topic, because we all need to collectively start thinking more about migrants, especially the so-called invisible migrants of our city. They run our city's economy, but unfortunately have not got their due. They don't have a political voice because they usually don't vote in the cities. They vote back home. And so because they don't have a political voice, they are completely locked out. They're truly an invisible workforce in India, which in a strange way, the pandemic last year for the first time visibilized, and we need to be doing much more in order to provide social security and economic security to this migrant workforce. So with that, I'll end. Be happy to take questions. These are the two books. I run a social media handle called BizEconHist on Instagram and Twitter. And we also run an internship on business and economic history, pitched at masters and PhD students at IMET. But if there are any students interested, all the details are online. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions. I think you're on mute.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. If anybody wants to ask any doubt, can ask now.
I have a question. It was a wonderful expression to make, essentially because the psyche behind any kind of migration. First and foremost, we were under impression that generally migration takes place because of two reasons. One is insecurity, and second is the capacity to survive. And capacity to survive is got multiple fold. One is, of course, medical reason, and second is economic reason. But taking this drastic step, what is the psychology of people who really migrate in this fashion, knowing fully well that if his native place is in Bihar and he starts walking from Mumbai back to Bihar, he will never reach. Is that force which is going to push him out of his nest here, that compulsive to take a risk of not even reaching in person back home? How does it work?
I think the way to see this is that for the migrant worker, the city is a symbol of economic security, but the village is a symbol of social security. I think that's the best framework to understand.
So I would like to add a question to what Sir just asked, to what Bansi Sir said. Sure. I would just want to add something, so maybe you could answer it together. Sir said about the force which is driving these people back home. It is not that they have any promised income there as well. They may have a house there, but it is not that they will have any economic security after a point of time, because it's not that they're going to return back soon to the city again. So after a point, that economic security is not there as well. So what is that which, as Sir said, is so compelling for them to take an action that they walk back, where they may not reach the destination?
So very, very pertinent questions. I think if you start from this framework, the average migrant worker has economic security. By economic security means paisa, cash, right? By social security, we mean two things. One is the social security provided by the family. This is the social security in terms of, that the fact that your mother is there at home. It's kind of, let's talk about, personal affection, that sort of a psychological security that you get. That is one at the family level, back home in the village. But there is also the social security of the state, which is the government. Right? That is, you have access to basically free food at home because you have that ration card, whereas you don't really have access to a lot of services in the city because you don't have access to health facilities, for example, in the city because you're not domiciled enough. Right? So for interstate migration, the lack of portability of social security means that you're completely at the mercy of the income. So the decision to move back is very simple. If you have economic security in the city, you will be there for X number of months in the year. What happens in the lockdown like we had last year was that economic security dried up. So then the psychology is such that, okay, what are we really in the city for? If we are not getting the money, we might as well be back with our family for two reasons. Being with the family at a very personal level, all of us want to be with our families, right? And if something happens to us and so on, that's it's important to be with the family. But two, that you will get some access to the state because you're born there. In India, social security, welfare services, everything is tied to your place of birth. So these are the two basic ways to understand it. And that is why a lot of people went. Now, in terms of capacity to stay in the city, when the Prime Minister said 3 weeks, that's not when the migration crisis started. The migration crisis started when there was a lot of inconsistency in when the lockdown would end. A lot of migrants said, okay, if we have to stay for a few weeks, we can do that. What happened was that it got extended by 1 week. Then different states started having their own rules. It started one more week, one more week, one more week. Remember, on when March 24th it was announced for 3 weeks, I was supposed to stop by about April 15th. The migration crisis began in a huge way in India between April 15th and April 30th last year. And that's because people could not see how long it was going into. Right. And so that's when the eviction started. That's when landlords said, okay, if you're not going to give me money, don't stay in the house. That's when migrants themselves took the choice saying, look, if they are saying 3 weeks, I can do it. But if it's going to be, what if it's going to be 3 months? And if I don't have money, I'm going to starve. I don't have access to food. So that's the kind of psychology which pushed a lot of people into saying, okay, let's try this option. Now, it is not the case that, of course, everyone, walked home. People were obviously smart. They were continuously going to the stations. We saw those visuals last year. From Gujarat, for example, the government was pushing them back. They were canceling the buses and pushing them back, saying, no, you have to stay here. That's the meaning of the lockdown and so on. But what very quickly happened is that two things. One is some people, as I think somebody's put in the chat box, some people did started reaching home, and because everyone has a phone nowadays, the news started filtering that, look, it's possible. And so that possibility, coupled with this uncertainty between April 15th and April 30th, meant that a huge number of migrant workers started taking the decision. It's not the case that from day one, people said, okay, let's go home. Like rational human beings, they played out the probabilities and said, look, it's easier to kind of go back. I'll give you this example from my own personal experience when I was caught in the Mumbai floods of 2005. Right? So all of you, I'm sure, have been part of the great floods. I mean, every year floods, but 2005 was an unusually devastating flood in Mumbai. And I was a college student, and I was stuck in Bandra, and I had to make a choice to go back home or stay where I was. And where I was staying in the middle of the road, the waters were rising. Right? And all of us in that particular area took the decision in that particular context. The calculation was, look, if we go back home, we know we are safe. Right? So this is the proverb, this is the metaphor. That is, as the water levels start rising where you are, then you take the risk and you walk. And so just like I walked those 3 kilometers in the waist length water to get back home, the migrants walked 1,000 kilometers to get back. It's the proverbial waters rising to your neck that pushed out a lot of migrants to take the risk. I think that's how I think I would see it. Most of the people who went back were men, again, because circular migrants are mostly men. It was really horrific when it was women and children also involved. And of course, it was very painful. People died, on this journey. It was a very, very sad affair. I do think the trains, some minimal trains, could have been, what they did with the Shramik trains, they could have done on April 1st itself. I think the Shramik trains came 1 month too late. They should have done it in the first place. I had written an op-ed piece on March 26th in the Hindustan Times after the lockdown was announced, saying, look, this is going to be a crisis. I have served on the government committee on migration, India's first policy draft on migration. I've been a member of that group in 2016-17. It was kind of puzzling because the government, we've been working with the same government at the union, on a variety of issues of migration. I think there's some kind of a blind spot when it came to pandemic. I think they kind of panicked and then they hit the button. So it was completely avoidable crisis in my view. But I think we've learned some of those lessons in 2021, and so thankfully we've not seen those kind of scenes this year.
Yes, anyone else? It's okay. Now we are turning towards the next part of the session. But before that, sir, your lecture is very good, resourceful and scholarly lecture. I'm telling you that we know the word migrant or migration, but so much behind this that we know now. And there are many, you highlighted very well with the help of your slides, then pictures, facts and figures, maps, and so on, and really tried to depict a vivid picture before us. So thank you very much, sir. Definitely your scholarly lecture added knowledge with us about migration, and also how migration is related to pandemics, and again what things are required to control pandemics, etc. That also you highlighted. Definitely, our that participants are benefited by your lecture. Now I am turning to, so thanks once again, sir, for your nice lecture. Now I am requesting to Nikhil sir, because it's a time of vote of thanks now, because the session is near about over. So I request to Nikhil sir, please take the charge of session and express vote of thanks.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Rani sir. Uh, I'm very happy to take this opportunity to express vote of thanks for this session. Now, usually we make this vote of thanks very formal, but I'm very happy today to have this opportunity because Dr. Chinmay has literally made us travel all these 100 years and provided social context, economics context for what has been happening in our country for good part of last 1 year. We always wonder why we should learn history. We always, because see, I'm a commerce student, right? So for me, why should I learn history? And I think today's session provides us with a wonderful example as to how historical context make us realize the sense of our reality today. So I think for this particular thing, Dr. Chinmay, I'm very thankful to you personally. But as far as the session is concerned, let me tell you the journey that we have traveled with you, understanding this history of migrations and impact on pandemic. Now I don't know how to basically categorize your session, sir. Whether it was historical, whether it was related to finance, it was related to economics, it was related to sociology, so many disciplines and so many wonderful and beautiful anecdotes. Thank you very much. On behalf of PTVS, Modern College of Commerce, I take this opportunity to thank you for sharing the wonderful knowledge with us today. And I'm sure in coming future, we will see you on many more platforms, but especially we will be very happy to welcome you back again and again.
Thank you so much.
And I also would like to take this opportunity to thank our principal madam because it was her initiative and drive which has made it possible that we could listen to Dr. Chinmay today. So our principal, respected Dr. Sonali Pednekar madam, I really thanks from bottom of our heart because it was your drive and initiative which made this today's session possible. Thank you very much, madam. Your leadership ensures that we always travel forward and we always are progressing ahead. All our programs, all our events of Modern College of Commerce are possible and we are able to organize them because of our management, Parliamentary Vidyalaya Association. And I'm very happy that today Sri Bansi Dhurandhar sir was also available with us. He patiently listened to the entire session and also he was, he interacted in form of his question. So I think it was very nice to see that, our management is being so interactive and so supporting and encouraging. I take this opportunity to thank our entire board of PTVA, and it's added pleasure that Bansi sir is here to receive our gratitude in person. Thank you very much, Bansi sir, for your kind presence and such a lovely interaction. We are also joined by teachers, faculties, and students from other institutions of PTVA. I am very thankful to them for making this session interactive and informative with their queries and suggestions. I extend my gratitude to our members of faculty and especially our students for joining in. Thank you very much, Chinmay sir, once again for the wonderful session, and we look forward for more sessions from you in near future. Back to Dr. Rani sir. Thank you.
Nikhil, thank you for that comment. Why I ask questions now is because when I was school and in college, the teacher used to ask me a question which I was unable to answer.
Sir, you are always very kind, sir.
Anyway, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tumbe. It was nice of you on behalf of the association, Parliamentary Vidyalaya Association. I thank you for sparing your time and expressing your thoughts. It was a new subject. Obviously, people have seen the, so to say, struggle what people had to go through migration. And the concept of migration was very well described by you. So nice of you. There is one more subject which is, of course, bothering everyone nowadays, and people have been talking about is migration, difference in migration and trafficking. And that's what, in fact, in the afternoon, I was on another seminar when we talked about the ill effects of migration was trafficking also. And that's a huge kind of setbacks so far as social network is concerned. So what kind of preventive actions that we require to take? On one side, the plight of workers moving around from place to place, but what they sacrifice in the process is something very huge. And I think socially, if we become conscious about it, I'm sure we can find some solution to that. So again, thank you so much. And the management is always progressive, trying to work on these social issues also. And presentations like this give us more thought process to really work on. Again, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Pednekar, for organizing such a wonderful lecture.
Thank you, sir.
So nice of you.
So thank you, Chinmay. That was really very interesting, very insightful. And I'm so glad that we could have you on board today.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Since I started with Ratnagiri and the birthplace of Tilak, I thought I'd end with it. Mango season is just over. But as I read my book, Ratnagiri is famous for two things. You've heard about mangoes, but after this session, you also heard of mangoes. Migration is a huge part of the Tilak's journey as well as Ratnagiri's journey.
Right. One of these interesting tidbits is it's a very peculiar thing in India where when we have to write our personal information, we have a column for address and we have another column for permanent address. Yeah. One of the effects of migration.
In fact, my college ID card had something as birthplace.
Yeah. Many places have birthplace, but we have this dual address system that we require. So thank you all. Thank you once again. And
thank you.
Best wishes to you, Chinmay, for whatever you do in future.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Bye. Thank you all. Thank you all the participants. Now the session is